Welcome to the DarshanTalks Pharmacy live stream and podcast. We discuss pharmacy entrepreneurship and issues that may arise. If you like these videos and podcasts, please like, leave a comment, please subscribe. You know you want to. This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on third-party issues, state board issues, contracting, pharmacy purchase and sales issues, and more, especially in the context of fraud and compliance. Reach out now at darshan@kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. You can also just visit our website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I am here with the one, the only Jonathan Ogurchak. He's known mostly for not being at home. He has spent all of 36 hours in his house while he has been traveling the country coast to coast and telling everyone about the Stack product. So I'm really excited to have him. Jonathan, tell us more about yourself.
Darshan, thanks so much for having me back. So Jonathan Ogurchak, I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Stack. We built a compliance and regulatory product for pharmacies just to help them to manage all of the stuff that they needed and to take better care of patients. So accreditation, licensing, compliance, trainings, you name it, we can manage that in our platform. And then over the course of the last of the pandemic, when pharmacies didn't want to talk to us, we moved into the space to manage professional associations and higher ed, particularly around medical higher ed and medical associations. So we've been doing a lot to help grow memberships and help to create some synergies between those associations, those higher ed institutions, and the commercial side of things with the pharmacies themselves. I think since you and I last talked, we actually, part of the roadshow the last couple of weeks, we actually launched our second product here commercially, which is a patient management tool. It's a product we're calling Cadence. Shameless plug behind me here. I should say not launching September because we've launched it officially at the NASP meeting a couple of weeks ago. But we built a product that's designed to sit on top of the dispensing system in any pharmacy and pick up their workflow. So that way you can build a customized call cadence, essentially, of how you're going to manage intake, how you're going to manage authorization, how you'll manage anything clinically, and push that patient through while leveraging the dispensing data that's associated as well. So, we're excited. It's been a busy couple of weeks, but I'm excited for the opportunity to be back to talk with you.
Well, but before we go down the conversation you and I are going to have, I actually have a question about Cadence. Who is the ideal client for Cadence?
It really depends. Ultimately, it's geared for a pharmacy because they probably have a system of record that's doing bits and pieces of this today. But really, our goal was to take all of those components and align them into one platform. So that way you don't have Post-it notes sitting on a cube to say, oh, this is a patient that's on this insurance, I need to do this. We'll look at the claim. We'll look at the BIN number, the PCN number, the NDC number, and we can customize the system is designed to automatically custom tailor whatever those questions are that need to be asked. So you're asking the right questions at that right point in time. And ultimately, we're looking at expanding that beyond, because as you start to look at healthcare in general, kind of what we're talking about today, actually, there's a lot of affiliated and associated stuff, but it's also very disjointed and disconnected. And I think back to my days of owning a pharmacy, we would spend so much time trying to build a report based on manufacturer reporting requirements or payer reporting requirements. And there was really no method to the madness. Like there wasn't a standardized data in. So if I put junk in, I'd get junk out, or my partner would get junk out. So what we've done with Cadence is we've taken our Stack curated cloud that we built that manages things that should be standardized, like licensing and accreditation. We built that right into Cadence. So that way, as we continue our conversations and we continue to grow as a product, we're having conversations with pharma, with payers to say, what do you want to know about your patients? Let's put those questions into a standardized format. And if Darshan's pharmacy wants to manage this drug, come and download them from the cloud. It goes right into the workflow. And there's more of an assurance that you're getting good data in as opposed to not.
So why would, and this may land up just being a plug for Cadence all today, but we'll figure it out. My question for you is, why has there been no standardization so far? I mean, I worked as a pharmacist for 20 years, and that was always a pain. Everyone's doing something slightly different, and you're always trying to just sort of keep up. And I mean, it's not just pharmacies. Let's not even pretend this is just a pharmacy issue. It's even worse if you're in a doctor's office where you're trying to manage all these different issues. So,
well, it goes back to kind of our topic for today, like interoperability. Let's here. I'll make not a shameless plug. We'll tie it back into conversation here. But interoperability has been this term that's been dogging the industry now, and it's like that sexy thing that everybody's been talking about, like, oh, let's make it interoperable, let's do this, let's do that. For so long, look at pharmacy in general. There's a standard way that your pharmacy was going to bill a claim, and you knew that it was this quantity, this day supply, this NDC. There was a language that was established many moons ago at the advent of electronic billing that everybody adopted, and that became the norm. The same isn't true when it comes to doing all of those other activities. So the things that a pharmacist really is empowered to do, like counseling a patient and talking to them about clinical resources, or if you're a doctor and you're trying to look at standards of care within a particular disease state, there's not a data framework approved to support those things. And now you're starting to get a little bit closer on the medical side as you're seeing federally funded mandates for things like smart on fire capable health EMR systems. But there hasn't been a standard. It's been the Apple Watch standard for Apple, and I have my health records here. But if I have an Android phone, it's going into Google Health. We get some parity, but not a ton. And so I think that's been the biggest challenge across all of healthcare, is there's been a lack of definition for what it is that we're looking to accomplish. It's not as straightforward as quantity and day supply, but what happens when you're looking at managing an HIV patient and tracking their viral load?
Yeah,
I'm going to document it differently than you might, and it might just be in a spreadsheet. There's no real validity to actually show that it works. But you bet your butt somewhere at a lab diagnostic center, they have a standardized way to capture that. Let's find a way that we can start to talk together. And that's where that concept of interoperability, I think, has really been taking shape.
I mean, I think this is wonderful from a provider perspective, right? To have some common language so that all of us are communicating. But you pointed out a very important thing, which was you've got this situation where Apple's got some of your data and Google's got some other one, and Epic as a third, and your pharmacy system as a fourth. How do I, as a patient, go, this is all well and good, but how do I control my actual data? I don't even know who all the players are. Forget telling them that you shouldn't have this data.
Well, that's it's actually a very good question, because as of yesterday, we're recording this now on October 7th. As of yesterday, October 6th, a number of the initiatives that were part of the 21st Century Cures Act went into effect, and a lot of those actually surrounded data ownership and ownership at the patient level. Think about yourself. If you were to go and have a conversation with your doctor and say, "Hey, I'd like a copy of my MRI results," it's days later and dollars spent potentially to acquire those records that are really yours. That's your person on that radiography report. It's making sure that those things are available. One of those big initiatives that did go into effect yesterday was making sure that patient data is truly owned by the patient. You now have a difference in the rights that are available to you as a patient for who that data is disclosed to. At the federal level. And more importantly, your access to that data now needs to be available on demand upon request. And so it's not like they flipped the switch yesterday and surprise, I have my MRI of my knee from 10 years ago showing up in my iPhone, but it's now law, and it's now the onus is on the providers or the software providers that they leverage to make those records available on demand. And I think that the next big hurdle is going to be standardization of that. So that way there is that connectivity or interoperability between, my Cerner system and my Epic system and my Apple Watch. Like there's that next step that's still to come, but we now have some teeth behind it to actually say, this is why you got to go and invest to do these things.
So let's start from the first part of that question, which is, and again, I'm technically the lawyer in this situation, but you're gonna educate me. So we'll go from that perspective.
We'll see about that, but let's go.
So the question I have is, what is a patient? And the reason I'm asking this question is I'm thinking about, I do a bunch of work in clinical research, and one of the big arguments is someone who's coming in to do clinical research an actual patient, because they don't have a reasonable expectation of being treated. So can a subject in a clinical trial say, you need to give me my data?
That's an excellent question. And being not the attorney on this conversation today, I will have to defer to anybody who's listening to reach out to an attorney such as yourself to have some advice on that. And that is one of those questions that comes about. I think in the premise and the scope that it was kind of advertised thus far, at least to my knowledge, related to this, it was focused on that end user patient who has received some form of diagnosis, some form of medical guidance or care, and was documented as such. Once you trickle upstream into the pre-diagnostic, preclinical stuff, I'm not entirely sure, but that will definitely have to be a topic for another one of these conversations, because I need to dig into that myself.
Because it's a really interesting question, because there's a whole movement happening right now, and I know you've seen this happen, where CVS and Walgreens and all are talking about this new phenomenon called decentralized studies. And in that context, what they're talking about is, why are you going to the doctor's office? We have all the patients anyways. Why don't you come to us and we will do the studies for you, or at least we'll have the patients here for you. And we have the list of patients who can do things, blah, blah, blah. So my question in that scenario is, if that is the scenario, is that information subject to the Cures Act? And it may or may not be, is what I'm hearing. But
that's something I'm going to need to dig into, because that's something that has always affected our practice, kind of tangentially. When I've been in specialty pharmacy practice, oftentimes we're helping to capture data that's a post-commercial study that is going to benefit these things, where data opt-in, data privacy, data opt-out, like all those components came into play. And I'm not exactly sure how that will work when it comes more to the de-identified clinical piece of those things, as opposed to, hi, I'm Jonathan, I just had an MRI on my neck, I need to get a copy of it, or I need to get a copy of your chart notes and things of that nature. But it is some of the reports that I've seen in those patient-facing things have been very, very eye-opening to the patients in particular. There was a case study, I think that article that I had shared with you, the patient was now being exposed to all of the communication back and forth via email from practitioner to practitioner. And I think that's going to, may have been the extreme case of things, to say, well, here's all of the stuff that you're now learning about the conversations going into a diagnosis, as opposed to standardizing those elements of care that truly are necessary to drive your care forward as a patient.
The interesting part about this, as I continue, is this idea that there are two there's one reason I asked this question. I'll go into a different question altogether. In the pharma world, when you do clinical research, one of the big dreams, if you will, is we want to be able to give patients the results of their studies and the results of the tests and stuff that we did on you. Hopefully, you benefit out of this as much as we did, we as the pharma company did. The big problem is the pharma company doesn't know who these patients are, because they're blinded. So the question then becomes, who would put the information in there? Will the doctor's office put it into a portal that the pharma company manages, or will Epic and Cerner create their own clinical trial portal that the pharma company somehow pays for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So that'll be an interesting thing to explore as we continue. But that brings the other question into play. If I remember correctly, Epic is owned by a single family, if I remember correctly.
I believe so. I believe it.
Yeah. And they're obviously incredibly powerful, the number one EMR system in the country, maybe in the world, I'm not sure. But the point being, if it's so powerful, they must have lost some serious lobbying efforts to be required to share the data that they have with Cerner and other companies. Do you think that this is going to change how information gets shared, and therefore allow for the dominance of new EMR systems?
I would like to think so. And again, they're the largest for a reason. There's other players in that space that have dominated for a long time, because they do things and they do them really well.
Yeah.
I think that and you see this when you're talking about innovation and disruption and all of these types of buzzwords that have been a part of our vocabulary over the last several years. You're starting to see that the innovators in the space are those that can come in and kind of upend that status quo. And if there's ways that you can look to align or integrate new features and new capabilities with the existing, you're not totally upsetting the entire flow, but you're now helping to improve what's there, and you're improving what everybody kind of accepted as the best of the worst type of scenario. And I think that that's where we're likely going to see more of this sea change in managing patient data. It's now that the data is more widely available, or intended to be more widely available and shared, giving patients more of an ability to do with it as they choose. Is there a high likelihood that you can go and get an easier second opinion when you have that new onset diagnosis that you're kind of questioning? Or is it something where vendors in the space, we've been doing a lot of work with remote patient monitoring devices that really have a hard time with connecting with the patient. And more importantly, if I have an RPM device that's in the home that's managing my outpatient consumed pharmaceutical, how does that tie into any outcomes upstream from the medical perspective? Do you really have the ability to see, well, because this patient was taking their ACE inhibitor and they're checking their blood pressure and it's controlled, that prevented them from a cardiac event and ending up in the hospital where there was a higher incremental cost of care? So I think that it does open up a lot of new doors. And to your point, whether it's new EMR systems or new iterations of how existing technologies may be leveraged, I think it's now going to give us you're going to see a opening of opportunity as opposed to sure, you'll have the lobbyists say like, oh man, like we lost our spot. But I think that those are the types of events in when you look at history that really help to catalyze change. And I think that that's where healthcare as an industry has really been stymied, is because they have not been open to some of that change. It's
interesting. It reminds me, and this is where I'm going to date myself. And Jonathan, you look like a much younger person than I am, but I'm going to tell you, in the early 2000s, I used to have this app called ICQ. Do you even remember what that was?
I don't remember ICQ. But
there was also one called Microsoft Messenger, and then there was Yahoo.
Now I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
So I remember it happening where you had to be on each individual platform to talk to other people on that platform. Eventually, they were like, oh, let's create a common space where we can all chat with each other. So I could be on Messenger chatting with someone on ICQ. I could be on AIM chatting with someone on Messenger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I remember at that point, they all just sort of blended together, and you'd get new apps that weren't any of these, that just aggregated all of them. And the result of it was that this interoperability caused these companies to sort of lose their market dominance, because it didn't matter what platform you were on anymore. What mattered was, can I talk to each other? Do you think that this interoperability is going to have that same type of effect, which is, it doesn't matter if you're on Epic, it doesn't matter if you're on Cerner or Athena or something else?
I think for the vendors themselves, possibly. And I think that's it. I jotted that down because I'm gonna borrow that analogy at some point in the future, I'm sure. But that's an excellent example. When things went from these very disconnected processes to more of a streamlined approach, it made the connectivity piece much more streamlined, but those brands did lose their identity. At the same time, it forced those brands to innovate or no longer be viable options. I mean, if you look at something like America Online, AIM, they couldn't innovate to the pace that they needed to, and so they became part of an entity that was willing and able to do those things. If you look at Yahoo Messenger, things like that. Again, trying to date myself here, but there were these things that came about from a next steps perspective, where as the innovation started to standardize, the innovation then blossomed in another direction that was more purposeful and meaningful.
I'm going to challenge you on that. None of those exist right now. So did it really blossom? I mean, right now, we're all trying to just go back to SMS and maybe WhatsApp. Those are like the two big ones at this point. We got rid of chat systems to go into social media, if you will, for lack of a better term. So I'm not sure that was an evolution as much as I'm sick of this, because none of the companies wanted to put money into innovate, because they knew that they couldn't get very far with it. Do you think there might be a disruptive influence, so much so that the EMR systems go, there's no point in me putting in money to innovate because I'm just as replaceable as someone else? Now, something like Epic, on the other hand, they have some advantages because they have 10-year contracts and some of the data ownership issues and stuff like that. But even that got addressed, right? Because you just mentioned data ownership goes back to the
Absolutely. That's a very valid point. And if you look at it, that's where I was trying to think of like where I had seen the ICQ and the Java. Like there's still places in like your Apple contact book where you could store those values. I mean, it's still the language, the intent, the capacity to do is still there. Yeah. But it's largely been accumulated through some other piece. It's not like a lot of these businesses were done. They were acquired and assimilated to. And I'm wondering if that's
let's take those examples. Sort of AOL just sort of went away. I'm sure it was acquired, but meaninglessly. Yahoo's still sort of hobbling along. Yeah. Microsoft just basically killed their app. ICQ basically died, as far as I can tell. It may have been bought out, but there's really been no actual movement. Or did I miss something? Maybe I missed something.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking of it from an evolutionary perspective. Even when you think of things like Skype to Teams to Zoom, the need for communication and the methods have kind of evolved over time. You're not worried about putting up your away message and coming up with a cool lyric that you could put up for the day, but like that messaging frequency has now changed with the sign of the times. You're not necessarily as glued to a device where you're worried about your dial-up connection kicking you off or something like that. Now that we're so interconnected and we have a device with us at all hours of the day, the messaging behind that has adopted to change with that as well. And that's where I think that, while those platforms themselves might have vanished as entities, the evolution of the need came along with that. And so now you have your TikToks and your iMessage, and you have these things that didn't exist at the time that those did, but those methods of communication, WhatsApp, those communication methods have evolved to meet the needs of consumers where they are. And I think that hopefully that's where we'll be with healthcare.
But let's take exactly all three examples you just picked. You just mentioned TikTok, you mentioned WhatsApp, and you mentioned, what was the third one?
Just iMessage, just something like that. Yeah.
Did you notice none of them communicate with each other?
Well, from an interoperability perspective, though, interestingly enough, there's been a number of legislative components trying to move the iMessage capability over into an SMS type of offering, and that's been something that Apple's been litigating against for a while. But it's the thought of, well, let's take and meet people where they are, and then move thereafter. So I don't know. That's where it's a really valid point to kind of to arbitrate over. It's I think from the end user perspective as a patient. Thinking of like the medical piece of things, when you have no access to it right now, or very limited access. Just like having WhatsApp on my phone, and I was tied to my big old compact desktop computer. As the need changed, the availability of that information changed. So now you're always connected. Now let's hope that there's some similarity to that from a medical perspective. Now that we have the ability to access and tie into all of those parties, does that empower those patients or those providers to have a better sense of care?
I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that this is great for the patient, at least in the short term, right? Without a doubt. But the result of it is the EMR providers stop innovating because they can't get any advantage out of it. And the lack of innovation hurts patients in the long term because the investment simply doesn't go in anymore. Because they go, it doesn't matter what I put in. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's going to transform how that patient data is managed. When you think of patient data today, and think of a community pharmacy experience, unbeknownst to you, when you go pick up your script at the counter, that data is being aggregated, it's being sliced, it's being diced. There's something happening with that antibiotic that I just picked up that ties it back to that prescriber's prescribing patterns, that then sends a sales rep into an office to say, hey, doc, you need to write for something else.
IQVIA makes a bunch of money off of that.
And others. There's a bunch of people that are in that similar space. I think that what this does is it's going to change the whole dynamic for that piece overall. There's a reason why the EMR systems feed so seamlessly into that data sharing model that happens at the outpatient setting, because there's dollars to be made by doing that. I think if the data visibility now has a potential to dry up or go elsewhere, there's going to need to be an investment somewhere, because they're going to need to find ways to remonetize or revalue that information in a different light, I think.
So that raises two new questions that I have. my first one is the idea that what you're really talking about is what this is creating, without really saying that, is centralization of information. Because in the end, it may be, or maybe if you want to call it differently, the decentralization of information. Everyone will have their piece of the pie. But the result of that is that you've now just created multiple hacking risks, because anyone who is allowing for data to be shared is also allowing for a cybersecurity risk to be shared as well. You kind of have to. Do you think that I'm seeing a woeful inadequacy of knowledge around cybersecurity, especially in the pharmacy world, but I'm also seeing it in the medical world. Do you think this? Am I sort of exaggerating the issue in my head?
No, I think the risk is always there, and I think that we've seen, even coming out of the pandemic, we've seen leaps and bounds when it comes to issues of cybersecurity, just related to, hey, I just had my COVID result available, let's send a text message. Those things were not in place.
Correct.
To the level that they are, the level of security that they are today. So I think it's the ability to leverage some of that learnings and some of that technology to feed that forward into other use cases. Now, that's, there's a difference between health security and me leaving my phone unlocked and somebody gets your phone number and then they call you for a referral or something like that. But it's health information is a very different space to be practicing in. And I think that those providers have already seen ways to do multi-factor authentication before you get into your own patient record to make sure that that's the case. I can't log in to see my Quest Diagnostics result unless I can validate those HIPAA fields that would tie that to me as a PHA. It's not like I'm just clicking the button and it says, surprise, here's your stuff. So, I think that there's been a drastic maturity in the management of personal health data just over the last couple of years, because there's been a need to. And I'm hopeful that because of that, it's tech that could be leveraged into these new spaces.
But it reminds me of the issue of a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So the fact is that you're right. Quest probably has a really good system out there, and Epic probably has a really good system out there, and Athena probably has a good system out there, and Cerner doesn't, blah, 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 blah. But someone has a weak system, and that someone is now connected to everyone.
Well, and I think that that's where it's a very unique process. And I again, now owning a software company that has PHI as the patient management piece, we've had a lot of learnings about what's the minimum necessary to be able to store for your own solution. And I think that from a cybersecurity perspective, as we connect with more and more dispensing systems, I don't need to store their whole database, because that's just opening me up for more risk. That's opening up a patient for more risk. Let's find things that we can store temporarily in real time that still ties it back to the patient. Still what we need to do. Yeah, via an API. I mean, that's the whole point behind Smart on Fire from an interoperability perspective. But
the problem is now you have an API that allows for that access, and that the problem is your system you at Stack have created the super secure system, but me as Darshan has created the simplest, like the cheapest thing I could make, and now someone's hacked into my system. I have an API into yours, an API into Cerner, and does that expose everyone to risk?
Well, no, and I think that's the beauty of the API connectivity piece of things, because it's only exposing the things that need to be exposed. I think that's where it's not like it's opening up the entire keys to the castle. I'm seeing points of data at points in time when I need to see them. And I think that that's the beauty of the interoperability frameworks that are being designed and federally mandated now is the fact that it's only allowing you to see what you need to when you need to. If the beauty of our Cadence product is if a patient were to hack into the Cadence database, they'd see a de-identified ID number. Yeah, it goes back to the de-identified ID that you're talking about and the problems there. But what it's doing is it's taking my data set, even though it is HIPAA PHI data, but it's not saying this is Jonathan's data. So even if somebody gained access to my repository, it's not able to connect it upstream. And that's where a lot of the ONC guidance and the reason for Smart on Fire have been in place. It's to try to force the minimum used PHI, just so that way they can't segment those pieces as they need to.
Do you worry about leaky APIs?
I'm not. I mean, it'd be wrong of me to sit here and say, "Hey, I'm a software company." I am, but what we've seen in a lot of the framework that we've been building, particularly is across the RPM devices, some interoperability things, where these API keys are available. There's not room for leakage the way that it would have been in a system 5 or 6 years ago. It's really helped to cut down on that potentiality of breach, which helps cut down on potentiality of risk for all parties involved. So I think that, again, as things have evolved and become more mature, obviously the risk of hacking, the hackers will become more mature at trying to find those things, but they've also taken enough steps to be able to segregate risk, so that way it's not a true breach scenario like you used to see.
Let's use from gloom and doom. Let's talk about some one big advantage I can see. One of the things is that Israel is known as the startup nation, I believe, is the title they use, and they're very, very aggressive about the idea that we want innovation to sort of move forward. And as part of that process, they actually say, our COVID data, you can have access to the COVID data because we think that treatments will come out of this. This was one of the big things that came out of COVID. My question is, isn't that sort of something we're creating as we start creating interoperability? And as we build that interoperability, do you see, and I'll actually go back a sentence and come back. One of the big issues I see with people developing new software is I don't have a way of testing this. I need real data. I don't need just fictional data sets. I need to be able to test this against real data. What this is allowing you to do is essentially have access to real data from multiple vendors. And do you think this takes us to that next step to be the innovation nation like Israel?
Yeah, I think that's a point well taken, because what you're seeing, and to your point, there are data sets out there that do these things right now. I mean, there's ways that you can go into a number of different areas and you can gather and gain some of that de-identified data, but it doesn't always come back to the patient, or it has a very specific use case. And I think that what it's affording the opportunity to do is look at some of these buzzwords that people have been talking about, things like social determinants of health, things like population health, these things that we know hypothetically are going to affect how patients are cared for or managed, but actually put some teeth behind that. And that's one of the examples that I always use. When we was at the pharmacy previously, we knew what we knew about our subset of patients. We didn't know much else about another subset of patients that we weren't managing. I managed patients with HIV, and I knew what was going on geographically within that HIV population, but not HIV as a broader disease state. I think what this affords the opportunity to do is to have some of those innovative opportunities where you're now able to branch out and see more trends and more scale. And have the ability to do that. As simple as on my Apple Watch, there's the opportunity where you can opt into certain trials, and they've been tracking my heart rate now for the last 2 years to see if there are any trends that could be picked up. And you don't see, I become sort of that decentralized model that you're talking about. But I become the control. Hopefully, in a lot of these cases, I become the control for an AFib study to show how accurate something is at detecting AFib, because we have patients that have it, we have patients that are opting in that don't. Let's help to grow our denominator, so that way we can make things much more effective. And I think that's where, to your point, it does afford some opportunities there to grow innovation in that sense, because now you're opening it up to more than just populations who know to opt into a clinical trial or need to opt into a clinical trial. It's helping to create much more opportunity.
We can keep talking, and I could get into discussions about artificial intelligence and how this data now enables something like that, and we can have a whole other set of discussions. But we're well over time, and as always, this was absolutely incredible. Before we go, do you have any parting words?
I think that I'd just like to say the time is now. It's one of those things where we continue to talk about interoperability. It's been, I've been on webinars, I've been on podcasts, I've been on and CEs that are talking about this, but now it's here. There's finally some skin in the game and some reason for all parties involved to be driving it forward. And I'm just excited, and I hope that any of your listeners are too, because it's now the one article, the one I shared with you, is some people look at the line in the sand type of event where things from that point on are never going to be the same. And I'm hopeful that this is the same as it comes to patient health.
These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create an attorney-client relationship.